Hi, the objective of today's video would be to help you to answer NVIDIA's most commonly asked non-technical interview questions. And the way I gathered this list was based on previous experience and working with people who applied for these roles. Okay, question number one, the most commonly asked question in interviews with NVIDIA is, tell me about yourself. So your elevator pitch if you want. And what I would like to explain to you here is that there is a difference between how you would approach a tell me about yourself for a phone screening round, whereas when compared to answering tell me about yourself towards the final interview rounds. And by the way, NVIDIA has up to 12 interviews as the process, so you can imagine the process can be quite long. So my point is that towards the beginning of the hiring process, it's more of an impression-based hiring, when the dynamic of the conversation is very much, yeah, I think I like this person, maybe, okay, should I give you a chance as a candidate to progress forward to the process? Whereas towards the end of the process, they are really looking to screen you. Hey, are you who you say you are? Can you do the work that you said you did? So your tell me about yourself should be far more realistic, more down to earth, and of course not rewarded with AI, especially towards the final interview rounds. Okay, the other note I want to make here is that you'd want to adapt your answer to your interviewer's preferences. So for example, most of the time your interviewer will introduce themselves. Hey, a few things about me. And some interviewers will go on the longer side with introduction, while others will keep it super brief. Most of the time, people keep it brief. And if they prefer to keep it brief, then a good idea would be for you to follow their lead and you also to keep brief answers. Unless, of course, clarity of thought is a strength. You have interviews in which scenario you would probably want to go on the longer side, and the reasoning is to your advantage. Right? But these would be the main things you'd want to keep in mind for your elevator pitch. The second thing I'd like to talk about here would be, give me an example of a complex project from start to finish. Okay, what's that one thing you'd want to ensure that they remember about you, or a deep dive, if you want to call this as an interviewing technique. And this is seemingly an easy interview question, yet for a number of reasons, people still struggle to answer these or to make these deep dives properly. Now, I won't get into the details that you're talking about a deep dive which you didn't own, because then it's obvious you're going to struggle with this. But most of the time, people will forget details of some key highlight which maybe happened 10 years ago or 5 years ago. You will forget some key metrics from there. So that's why it's a good idea that you somewhat refresh your memory before your interview begins. Ideally, you can build a story bank, right? This is the professional way to prepare an interview, but the idea is that you'd want to prepare for a deep dive in an interview with NVIDIA. Another idea here would be to try to link your deep dive with one of their core values, one or more of their core values if you want. So, for example, your deep dive could be a showcase of you bringing excellence, right, high standards to the table, everything we do. Or another way would be your willingness to deal with risk, or your risk approach to dealing with complex situations, with highly ambiguous situations. And it's always a good idea that you try to structure your answers, for example, in the STAR format, and you also talk about some results, even quantifiable, even with some metrics, if ideally, and whatnot. But these things will become obvious once you start answering these for real. All right, the third question I'd like to talk about here, and by the way, these are questions which were repeatedly asked in interviews at NVIDIA with people that I work with. How do you handle disagreements with stakeholders? Okay, so I want you to notice right from the start, of course, the reason that they would ask you such a question in a job interview, how do you handle disagreements, would be to see how you handle conflict, okay, and your interpersonal skills in general, and your ability to maybe deal with people cross-functionally as well. So the objective is clear. what is not as clear for many, for I would say 85 to 90% of candidates, is that this question is open-ended. How do you handle conflicts? Okay, and by the simple fact that this question is open-ended instead of making it a classic behavioral question, tell me about the time when you had a disagreement with stakeholder, this will put many people off track from giving their best answers. How does this happen? Well, it happens because you would go on the generic side. You would talk about a time how you would deal with conflicts between stakeholders instead of specific times when you actually dealt with conflicts with stakeholders. And this is super important because it is probably more comfortable, or you think it's more likable that you showcase your way of reasoning in these job interviews for these types of questions. But unless you're applying for a people manager role, where this is supposed to be your subject matter expertise, it's not as a specific answer of times when you handled disagreements with stakeholders will always produce superior results as to when you showcase your philosophy of dealing with conflict, right? So even though the question is open-ended, your answer should be a specific one in the STAR format. And I've even had candidates, exceptional candidates, I must add, that were able to give 3 examples of times when they dealt with conflicts because, they felt like, yes, I want to highlight multiple scenarios so they can choose the one that they like best. I could develop more here. And there's even a corporate value at NVIDIA, one team. Okay, so they emphasize on these things. They're quite serious about these things, and I can tell you from experience, all FANG companies do emphasize on working with people that have, interpersonal skills, listening skills, and this sort of things, right? So dealing with conflict would be the 3rd most commonly asked topic in job interviews with NVIDIA. The 4th type of question I'd like to talk about here is, tell me about the time when you laid out a vision when there wasn't one. Okay, so what is vision for the role that you're applying for? It could be a sales plan, it could be a customer project, or could be some backend software. It very much depends on the type of the role you're applying and the type of role you have. Roles such as PMs, accountants, analysts will pitch this differently. However, the common denominator of this would be that you should sell yourself as the better candidate through your previous experiences of laying out a vision when there wasn't one. Okay, for people managers, it's quite clear you should showcase your vision around forming teams and working in teams and creating and developing high-performing teams. STAR format is also super relevant here because not most of the time, but sometimes people really enjoy talking about their vision over a certain project they had, that they forget to talk about some results towards the end, to mention a few numbers, maybe a few metrics, a few relevant achievements that you could even better sell yourself for the purpose of a job interview with NVIDIA. And by the way, NVIDIA doesn't call their non-technical interviews as behavioral. They just call them cultural fit, working in teams, and these sort of things, but they are behavioral. In my experience, they're at least 50% behavioral, even for purely technical roles. At least this has been my experience. Okay, and I've coached people who went through 11 interviews with them in one interview process. All right, so this was number 4. Okay, number 5. So the 5th topic you'd want to take seriously while preparing questions for an interview with NVIDIA would be prioritization. How do you prioritize? Again, if you remember, I previously had one of these questions about open-ended questions. How do you prioritize versus tell me about the time when you had to make a gut-wrenching prioritization. So this is one of the core reasons why basically nobody's giving great answers to these questions, because they open-ended and then you somewhat take the bait, if you want, by showcasing your vision around prioritization, which is not what actually sells in these job interviews. NVIDIA has a core value of speed. Okay, so this is why it's an extra reason for you to consider prioritization as a key topic when preparing the stories that you would want to sell yourself during these job interviews. Some of the best stories, if you'd want some references here, would also contain a few frameworks, prioritization frameworks, whatever framework makes the most sense to your role, right? Because you'd imagine a framework for prioritization is quite different from an accountant when compared to PM. Okay, so that's why I'm trying to keep it brief with these things, but I'm trying to give you some directions here. For example, in my training programs, I categorized these core values around some key behaviors, and I gave examples from a variety of roles to help you to reason by analogy, and therefore, eventually to speed up the prep process you're going to employ for the non-technical part of your interview. And even further, I added another round, a second section with some revisions, because I know that it takes at least 2 or 3 revisions to get these done right. Okay, number 6. The 6th question I'd like you to take seriously if you're interviewing with NVIDIA, and again, questions that are actually being asked in these interviews is, tell me about the time when you failed. Okay, so how do you deal with failure? Okay, and doing this for a number of years by now, I noticed that this is a great way for an interviewer to learn to determine if a candidate takes their interviews seriously. Because what happens is that if you go through lists of most commonly asked questions in behavioral interviews, it's impossible. You won't see this "tell me about the time when you failed" question. But if you see it for the first time, chances are you're going to come with some answers online. Well, you know what, I don't fail, and I never really had any major failures I can think of, simply because it's not, you don't feel good talking about failure, right? So what does it take to provide a great answer to a failure question? That would be learnings. Okay, so if you have some amazing learnings that you would like to share in your job interview, that's the best failure story you should choose. From experience, it will take you around 2 or 3 attempts to find the proper failure story, and I would even recommend you find at least 2 or 3 failure stories that you can present for your upcoming job interview. Now, a monumental mistake that I hope you won't do during your job interview would be to talk about a failure that's too recent and too dangerous. For example, you got fired from your previous role because you did a mistake. Okay, it's still, a job interview is a professional encounter. It's business, so you must have a little bit of commercialism if you want in yourself, not to get disqualified from these things, even if the learnings are super interesting. I believe this makes sense, right? But long story short, failure is also you'd want to take seriously while preparing a non-technical interview with NVIDIA. Question number 7 here. Again, something that I was quite surprised that they did ask these types of questions. How do you show customer obsession? Okay, so NVIDIA is not necessarily all over the place with the customer is the number 1 priority and whatnot, but this is a huge trend in pretty much any other FAANG company, that customer is number 1 priority. We are customer obsessed. And it looks like they do ask these questions around customer obsession, if I may go so. And you must determine what is customer in your role, because for highly technical roles, the customers will be internal ones, and then the challenge will be determined on whether you're speaking about the primary customer or the secondary customer, even internally, right? For roles whom are talking to external customer, then it's quite simple, and there's plenty of roles at NVIDIA, especially PM roles, involving customer success. So there, it makes a lot more sense, but customer obsession is something you would want to showcase. Also, another hidden reason for customer obsession and not customer support is that they want to figure out people with high standards. They want to understand that, for example, when I ask you, how do you show customer obsession? Well, I fix their bugs. If you present such a scenario, then it means your level, your baseline starting point is a very low one. You have low standards, because if you say that my customer obsession is fixing customer bugs, for other people, it might be things such as, hey, I come up with ideas that they didn't even realize they needed, and implemented them and proved them, hey, yes, it was a great success, and this proved to be the right path for them and for my business as well moving forward, right? So your baseline scenario must always be a super qualitative one. You should always insist on having super high standards in whatever you sell yourself for the purpose of job interviews. Again, customers means different things to different roles. If you're a PM working with external customers, then it's clear. If you're an accountant, maybe it's not as clear. If you're a developer, again, you must trend towards internal ones. Don't forget NVIDIA's core values of excellence and innovation, okay? Because this is what I think is the core thing to understand with these things. Number 8 question, it's a super commonly asked one in NVIDIA's interviews. Why do you want to join NVIDIA? And the primary reason I added this question to the list is because what happens is that like 95% of candidates compliment NVIDIA over and over again whenever they answer this question, which is, nothing wrong. However, if you put yourself in your interviewer's shoes, you'd hear the same thing over and over and over again, like everyone's complimenting them. Nobody's, getting a bit more peculiar with these things. And I once had a great idea suggested to me by someone from Microsoft, that, hey, another way you consider to answer this why NVIDIA is that, hey, you know what, I'm not sure I want to join you just yet. I'm just here to learn about the opportunity and see whether the type of experience I have will be mutually beneficial for this role. Okay, so you could also consider these scenarios to the extent your CV allows. And of course, maybe a bit early on in the process where, it really makes a difference in these types of impression-based hiring. Okay, but long story short, if you want to really make a difference in NVIDIA's interviews, it can be done. And even with with these why NVIDIA types of questions, if you think about it, what is that one thing that you're selling yourself on? What's your unique value proposition for this? And I found this also to be quite good. Best candidates I coach never give boring answers for some reason, so I always learn something from them, and I believe this is something extremely valuable for you to consider while preparing what you're going to say during your interviews. Okay, question number 9. If we hire you, what will be your focus in the first 30, 60, 90 days? Okay, so if you get the job, what's your 30, 60, 90 days plan? It's actually a relatively new interview question. It's a trending one, on the reasoning, hey, they haven't seen this one yet. So this might take you by surprise. However, from experience, it's nothing more, that, hey, have you ever done this? Have you ever been in a new role? Most of the time, you've already been in a new role, so you would know what plan you used and how you could further improve that. The reason why I'm saying if you've ever been through that is because I always advise people to answer questions behaviorally. Behaviorally means with past experiences. Even if the question is forward-looking, what's your plan 5 years from now? Still, I would link it to previous experiences because that's how you sell yourself best behaviorally in any non-technical interviews. This is what works. Okay, it's not the most. It's not easy to come up with such experiences. It's not easy to make connections this way, but again, it's something that I found it's extremely efficient for answering these types of questions. And last but not least, number 10 is a type of question I heard only at NVIDIA. I mean, asked on many occasions with NVIDIA's in particular. That would be, walk me through your resume. But this is a classic interview question. But the thing is that the level of detail, the deep dive that came up after asking this question was surprising to many of the people I worked with. So in other words, they simply said that these are people who previously worked in FANG, so they transitioned from FANG to NVIDIA. And they were surprised how interested their interviewers were in knowing more about the type of expertise of experiences they had, given what they already said in your CV, because your CV, I've seen some people who had 40 pages of CV, so that you have enough detail, but most people only have 1 or 2 pages in their CV, so you can imagine you cannot put everything in there. So that's some interviewers at NVIDIA and some interviewers towards the end of the interview process, the important ones, so to speak, are genuinely interested about the type of experience you have given your resume and will take a deep dive from your specific resume. So again, even if the question, walk me through your resume, is a pretty standard, boring one, at NVIDIA you should expect a deep dive, an uncomfortably deep dive through your resume. And if you remember, I said earlier in the beginning of the video that give me an example of a complex project from start to finish. So these questions are super efficient because they determine on your level of ownership in those projects. Because what happens is that if you didn't own that specific project, or it wasn't entirely your creation, so to speak, it will show in the smallest, in the details. So that will raise some concerns about your ability to own projects and how complex those projects were. So that's why preparing for deep dives with NVIDIA, I found it's a particularly efficient strategy. So I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.